Jonah's hands trembled as he watched the horizon burn with the orange glow of the setting sun. Beyond the hills, a small settlement lay quiet, too quiet. He had told himself he was doing the right thing. He had to survive. But the faces of his friends, the ones he had left behind to face the law, haunted him. The memory of their trust, the laughter shared in the long summer evenings now felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He had chosen safety over loyalty, and there was no turning back. The dispute had begun months earlier, a clash over land ownership between the settlers and the local authorities, with whispers of Apache involvement adding an unspoken danger to every step. Jonah had been a man of caution, never brave, always thinking several moves ahead. When the confrontation escalated and rumors of a raid spread, fear had overtaken him. The night he betrayed his friends, he had been shaking, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum of warning. He had led the authorities straight to the hideout, a secret cave hidden behind the thickets and rocks that he and his companions had discovered together. His friends had pleaded, eyes wide with disbelief and hurt, but he had been deaf to their cries. The thought of facing the wrath of the law, or worse, death, had been unbearable. Survival, he had convinced himself, was worth the cost. Now, hours after the betrayal, Jonah sat on a fallen log at the edge of the woods, staring at the smoke rising in the distance from the burned-out camp of those he abandoned. He remembered Thomas, the burly man with a quick laugh who had always called Jonah Little Shadow for his quiet ways. And Mary, with her hair like spun copper and a voice that could calm even the most frayed nerves. Their faces flickered in his mind like ghosts. He had imagined the authority men taking them into custody, the fear in their eyes, and yet he had done nothing to warn them. Guilt pressed on him heavier than the pack on his back. He had imagined freedom would feel sweet, but it tasted bitter. Each step he had taken away from the village felt like walking through molten earth. The ground beneath him seemed to reject him, punishing him for his cowardice. He had been careful not to look back too often, not to see the devastation his choices had wrought, but now, in the solitude of the forest, there was nothing to hide behind, no one to shield him from his own conscience. As night fell, the sounds of the wilderness grew louder, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a coyote, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Jonah wrapped his arms around himself, shivering, not from cold but from dread. He wondered if he had sold more than just safety. Perhaps he had sold his very soul. The law might spare him, but would his own heart? Could he ever forgive himself for abandoning those who trusted him most? Every fiber of his being screamed that he was a coward, that he was unworthy of the world he had clung to so desperately. And then, as the stars began to prick the night sky, a strange sense of stillness settled over him. In the quiet, Jonah realized that fear had driven his choices, but perhaps it could not define him entirely. If he was to live, he would have to face what came next, even if it meant walking paths he had never imagined. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, he knew, his life was poised on the edge of change. Whether that change would redeem him or break him further was yet to be seen. Jonah's journey, he sensed, was only beginning. His betrayal had burned bridges and scarred souls, but fate, as it often did in the wild lands of the frontier, had a way of offering second chances, sometimes from the most unexpected of sources. And as he sat beneath the cold gaze of the stars, he did not yet know that the hand of that chance would soon reach out to him, an Apache warrior, unafraid, and a promise of a new kind of home, where survival might be measured not in cowardice, but in courage of a different sort. Jonah left the scorched remains of the settlement before dawn, the first light painting the sky in pale gold. Each step away from the ruins felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself were trying to pull him back, forcing him to atone for his betrayal. His pack was light, containing little more than the bare necessities, yet it weighed on him with the burden of his guilt. The wind carried distant echoes of his friends' voices, laughter, shouts, pleas, and he imagined them following him through the trees. The wilderness, vast and untamed, stretched before him, offering both refuge and peril. Jonah knew that safety was not guaranteed, that the frontier had no mercy for the weak or the foolish, but he had no choice. He had burned every bridge behind him. Days blurred into one another as Jonah navigated the dense forest and rocky terrain. He survived by hunting small game, fishing in cold streams, and rationing the sparse supplies in his pack. Yet even as he sustained his body, his spirit withered. Loneliness was a harsh companion. The nights were the worst. Beneath the blanket of stars he could hear the world breathing, the whisper of the leaves, the soft murmur of the river. But it was nothing compared to the roar of his own conscience. He replayed the betrayal over and over, each memory stabbing like a knife. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of the underbrush made him flinch, as though the ghosts of his past were following him through the wilderness. Hunger gnawed at him, a relentless reminder of his fragility. There were moments when he considered returning to civilization, to try and explain himself, to plead for forgiveness. But the thought of facing the wrath of the authorities or the families he had abandoned paralyzed him. Fear, the same force that had driven his betrayal, now drove his flight. The irony was bitter. He had sacrificed his honor for safety, only to discover that survival alone brought no peace. On the 5th night, Jonah stumbled into a shallow ravine, exhausted and dehydrated. His knees buckled, sending him tumbling onto the damp earth, his breath ragged and shallow. Panic rose in his chest as he realized he could not continue much longer. The wilderness that had offered anonymity and safety now felt like a cage, tightening around him with every heartbeat. He lay there staring at the dark canopy above, willing himself to rise, to keep moving, but his body refused. Every muscle ached, every joint screamed for rest, and he knew that if he succumbed now, the forest would claim him as it had so many before. It was then, in that moment of utter vulnerability, that Jonah heard it, a rustling from the trees above, soft but deliberate. He froze, heart hammering, convinced that this was the end. Maybe it was a predator. Maybe it was a stranger with ill intent, but the instinct for survival forced him to glance upward. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and commanding, moving with a grace Jonah had never seen in a man. His eyes were sharp, his posture steady. Jonah could feel the weight of his gaze, but it was not filled with menace. There was curiosity, perhaps even a measure of understanding. The man approached without hurry, speaking in a low, calm voice that Jonah did not understand. Yet the tone carried reassurance. He extended a hand, offering water, and gestured toward a place nearby where Jonah could rest. Confused and wary, Jonah hesitated, fear and suspicion warring with the desperate need for help. Every instinct screamed to flee, but his body would not obey. The stranger knelt beside him, offering more than just water. He offered compassion, a rare commodity Jonah had not expected in these unforgiving lands. For the first time since his betrayal, Jonah allowed himself to rest, to let someone else bear a part of his burden. He did not yet know who this man was, or why he had chosen to help a broken, cowardly settler. But in that moment, the wilderness felt a little less hostile. There was still fear, still uncertainty, but there was also a glimmer of hope, a chance that the journey through darkness might one day lead to light. Jonah's flight, once a desperate attempt to escape judgment, was no longer just about survival. It was about discovering whether redemption could exist, even for a man who had sold out everything for safety. And as the figure guided him through the shadows of the forest, Jonah could not help but wonder if the path ahead would offer more than refuge, if it might also offer a way to reclaim the man he had lost. Jonah awoke to the soft, steady murmur of a stream, the sunlight filtering through the dense canopy above, painting the forest floor in dappled patterns. He tried to rise, but his body protested with every movement, aching muscles, blistered hands, and the lingering exhaustion of days spent fleeing through unforgiving terrain. As he struggled to sit up, he became aware of a presence nearby, silent yet commanding. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure stepping lightly over the roots and rocks, almost gliding across the forest floor. The man's skin was bronzed from the sun, his hair long and black, tied back in a braid. His eyes were sharp, steady and alive with an alertness Jonah had never encountered. There was no malice in his gaze, but there was power, a sense that this man belonged to the land in a way Jonah never could. Every instinct in Jonah's body screamed caution, yet the fear that had driven him to betrayal was now tempered by exhaustion. He had nowhere left to run. The figure knelt beside the stream, offering a small piece of jerky and a skin of water. Jonah's hands shook as he took them, unsure whether he should speak, move, or retreat. The man, noticing his hesitation, smiled faintly and spoke softly in a language Jonah did not understand. But the tone was not threatening. It was patient, even inviting. Jonah, desperate for relief, nodded, gulped the water, and sank to the ground. "Where am I?" Jonah rasped, his voice barely audible. The stranger did not answer with words Jonah could understand. Instead, he motioned for Jonah to follow him. gently guiding him through a narrow path along the riverbank. Every step felt surreal. Jonah had expected danger, perhaps even death, but the man moved with a calm assurance, a confidence rooted in harmony with the wilderness. There was something almost otherworldly in the way he navigated the forest. Every branch bent aside, every stone avoided, as if he were dancing with the land itself. Eventually, they arrived at a small clearing. Smoke curled lazily from a low fire, and Jonah's heart leapt. There were structures here, simple, sturdy, built with care, and figures moved about with quiet purpose. Villagers? Tribe members? He did not know. His mind raced with caution. He had fled humanity to escape judgment and violence, yet now he was surrounded by strangers. Strangers with spears and bows whose eyes watched him with keen intelligence. The man, Dakota, Jonah would later learn, gestured toward a space near the fire. He offered Jonah a blanket and motioned for him to rest. Jonah, trembling and wary, sank to the ground. For hours, Dakota remained nearby, silent but vigilant, his presence a shield against both fear and loneliness. Jonah could not understand the language, could not interpret the customs, but the gestures, the careful movements, the patience, these spoke louder than words. As twilight descended, Dakota finally crouched before Jonah, holding out his hands. In one, a small piece of cloth wrapped around herbs. In the other, a pouch of food. He pointed to Jonah's wounds, then to the healing herbs, and nodded. Jonah realized the man intended to tend to him. Despite the exhaustion in his limbs, Jonah's pride flared for a moment. He had never before allowed someone to care for him so completely. But the pang of guilt and the ache of relief overtook him. Over the next hours, Jonah felt his body relax in ways it hadn't in days. Dakota's hands worked methodically, washing, wrapping, and binding wounds with a care Jonah could not have imagined. And yet, beyond the physical healing, there was a subtle message in every action. The man did not see Jonah merely as a coward, a fugitive, or a man who had sold out for safety. He saw something else, perhaps potential, perhaps remorse, perhaps a chance for redemption. By the time night fully descended, Jonah lay near the fire, staring at the stars just beginning to prick the indigo sky. He had expected punishment, perhaps even hostility, yet instead he found patience, guidance, and a tentative safety he had not known since before the betrayal. He did not yet understand this world, this tribe, or the man who had saved him, but Jonah felt the first fragile thread of hope stretching through the wilderness. Somewhere deep within, he understood that his journey, once defined by fear, isolation, and betrayal, was about to take a turn. Dakota, the Apache warrior, had entered his life not merely as a savior of the body, but as a guide for the soul. Jonah would soon learn that survival alone was not enough. To live fully, he would have to confront the mistakes of his past and perhaps find a way to rebuild the man he had lost in the forest of fear. Jonah sat by the fire, the embers casting flickering shadows across his exhausted face. Dakota had not left him since the first night. The Apache warrior moved silently, tending the fire, preparing simple meals, and ensuring Jonah's injuries were healing properly. Every gesture carried intention, every motion a quiet lesson in patience and attentiveness. Jonah watched him, awe and suspicion mingling in his chest. He wanted to trust, but trust had led him into betrayal once before. Could he risk it again? Finally, Dakota approached him and spoke, this time in English, or at least words Jonah could barely understand. "You walk with fear. You carry it too far. Come." He extended his hand and then pointed toward a path leading deeper into the forest. Jonah hesitated. His body ached, his spirit was worn, yet something in Dakota's steady gaze urged him forward. The fear that had ruled him for weeks whispered that danger awaited. But another voice, softer, unfamiliar, told him that perhaps this path might offer more than safety. Perhaps it could offer a chance to be something more than a coward. Jonah rose slowly, unsure of what awaited. Dakota led him through a winding trail dense with trees and underbrush. With every step, Jonah felt the wilderness pressing in, not as a predator but as a living presence, vibrant and alive. The warrior never rushed him. Every gesture was deliberate, every glance measured. Jonah began to notice small things. The way birds seemed to scatter at Dakota's approach. The way the wind shifted around him as though acknowledging his presence. There was an almost sacred quality to the journey, and Jonah, for the first time in weeks, felt something other than fear coursing through him. After what seemed like hours, they arrived at the edge of a village. Simple structures of wood and earth nestled against a riverbank, smoke curling from small fires. The Apache people moved with quiet grace, each person's actions purposeful and harmonious. Children played with sticks and stones, their laughter piercing the soft hum of the river. Elderly men and women tended gardens or wove baskets, their expressions serene yet observant. Jonah's heart pounded. He had never seen a place so alive and orderly, yet it was not the order of rigid rules or fear. It was the order of understanding and respect, a rhythm in which each person seemed to know their place in the world. Dakota stopped at the village entrance and looked back at Jonah. "You may stay, you may heal, you may learn." His words were simple, yet they carried immense weight. Jonah wanted to argue, to protest that he did not belong here, that he was unworthy. But the sincerity in Dakota's eyes made him pause. He realized that this was more than an offer of shelter. It was an offer of trust, a rare and precious gift he had not earned but might yet deserve. One of the elders, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see into Jonah's very soul, stepped forward. She did not speak immediately but studied him, her gaze penetrating yet calm. Jonah felt naked under her scrutiny, every past mistake laid bare. After a long pause, she nodded once imperceptibly as if granting silent permission. The weight of judgment he had carried for so long seemed to lighten, replaced by a fragile hope. Dakota gestured to a small structure near the river. "This will be your home while you are with us," he said. Jonah looked at the modest dwelling, its walls rough but solid, its small fire pit ready for use. It was simple, yes, but it radiated warmth and security, something Jonah had not felt since before the betrayal. It was more than a house. It was a second chance, a tangible symbol that the world might allow him to make amends in his own way. As night fell and the village settled into quiet rhythms, Jonah sat at the edge of the river, staring at the reflection of the stars in the water. Fear was still there, of course, along with guilt and doubt, but for the first time he sensed the faint stirrings of something else. Trust. Not blind trust, not naive trust, but the careful, deliberate kind of trust that grows when someone believes in your potential even when you cannot. Dakota stood silently behind him, a sentinel and guide. "You have run far," he said, voice low but steady. "Now you may learn to walk." Jonah swallowed, the enormity of the offer settling into his chest. He did not yet know what it meant to truly live among these people, to rebuild his spirit and perhaps even his honor. But one thing was certain. The wilderness that had once threatened to consume him now held the possibility of salvation, and he would take it step by cautious step. Jonah's first days in the village were a study in humility. The Apache people moved with an effortless rhythm, each action purposeful, each task done with care and precision. Jonah, by contrast, stumbled clumsily, his hands rough and unpracticed, his mind cluttered with fear and shame. Every misstep felt magnified under the watchful eyes of the villagers. He had expected to be judged, perhaps even scorned, but the gentle patience of the people was something new, almost disorienting. He realized quickly that survival alone would not earn their trust. He would need to prove himself through effort, honesty, and willingness to learn. The first challenge came from Dakota himself. One morning, he handed Jonah a bundle of reeds and a knife, silently gesturing toward a small frame. Jonah squinted, uncertain what to do. Dakota merely nodded, eyes steady, encouraging without speaking a word. Jonah tried to bend the reeds to weave them together, but they cracked under his fingers, snapping back with a sharp sting. Frustration boiled inside him, but he reminded himself that patience was part of the lesson. He took a deep breath, studying the way Dakota had arranged similar reeds, trying again and again, guided only by observation and instinct. Hours passed, his fingers raw and bleeding slightly, but gradually the frame began to take shape. It was more than a lesson in craftsmanship. It was a lesson in humility. Jonah felt his pride, long buried under layers of fear and shame, rise in protest. He wanted to quit, to abandon the task as he had abandoned his friends in the past. But Dakota's calm presence was a silent command. Endure, learn, transform. The quiet discipline of the village, the unspoken expectation to rise above one's limitations, pressed against Jonah's old habits of cowardice and avoidance. Later that day, the elders called him to the fire circle. They did not speak in harsh tones, did not demand explanations or apologies. Instead, they asked him to observe, to listen, to understand. They posed challenges of thought as much as action: how to solve a conflict between children, how to interpret the signs of nature, how to weigh honesty against self-preservation. Jonah realized that these trials were tests not of skill alone, but of character. Each decision, each hesitation, each choice to act or remain silent reflected more about him than any weapon or physical feat ever could. At night, he would return to the small home Dakota had provided him, his body exhausted but his mind restless. The fire cast long shadows across the walls, and Jonah replayed the day's events over and over, questioning every action, analyzing every mistake. He felt a strange mixture of discomfort and exhilaration. Discomfort because he had never been stretched so thin, exhilaration because he was discovering that he could endure more than he thought. Each small victory in the trials of the day became a building block, a quiet affirmation that the man who had sold out for safety might yet rise to something greater. Yet the test was not solely about endurance or skill. The villagers observed his heart. They watched how he treated those weaker than himself, how he responded to frustration, how he carried the burden of guilt without allowing it to crush him entirely. Jonah had expected that the hardest part of this new life would be learning their customs or mastering new tasks, but he came to understand that the true challenge lay within, confronting his fear, embracing responsibility, and facing the shadows of the man he had been. Dakota remained the silent guide, always present yet never imposing. When Jonah faltered, the warrior offered a gentle correction or an encouraging glance. When Jonah succeeded, Dakota's approval was quiet but unmistakable. It was in these moments, between failure and triumph, between hesitation and action, that Jonah began to feel the first stirrings of a renewed self. By the end of the week, Jonah had woven a sturdy frame, resolved minor disputes in the village, and demonstrated a willingness to follow the village's rhythm without complaint. It was small progress, perhaps, but monumental to him. He understood finally that the path to redemption would not be quick or easy. Each day brought new lessons, each test a mirror reflecting his own flaws and potential. As he sat by the river that night, listening to the soft murmur of water and wind, Jonah realized that this trial, this quiet test of patience, endurance, and integrity, was shaping him in ways he had never imagined. The man who once ran for safety now faced the frontier not as a fugitive from fear, but as a man beginning the long journey toward courage, trust, and perhaps one day, forgiveness. Jonah had spent weeks learning the rhythm of the village, the early mornings, the steady work, the unspoken understanding that every action had meaning. It had begun to seep into him, slowly transforming the man who had fled in fear. Yet no matter how many lessons he learned or tasks he mastered, the weight of his betrayal remained. It was a shadow that clung to him, invisible to others but crushingly real to him. He wondered if it would ever lift, or if he would always be haunted by the man he had abandoned. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, Dakota approached Jonah with something unusual. In his hands he carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Curious, Jonah rose and stepped closer, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear this time, but anticipation. Dakota knelt before him, gently unwrapping the bundle. Inside was a simple pen, made of polished wood with a fine, delicate tip and a sheaf of clean, crisp paper. Jonah stared at it, puzzled. Dakota did not speak immediately. Instead, he extended the pen toward Jonah, then motioned toward the empty sheets of paper. Jonah's brow furrowed. Writing had never been his strength. He had always been a man of action, of survival, not of words. What could a pen do for a man who had spent his life running? Dakota's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. He spoke softly in the language Jonah understood now. The hand can build, the mind can heal, but the heart needs a voice. Jonah took the pen hesitantly. It felt foreign in his fingers, as if holding it bound him to a responsibility he was not sure he was ready to shoulder. Dakota nodded encouragingly, then gestured toward the paper. The message was clear: write, express, record, confront. Jonah felt a lump in his throat. How could words, mere marks on paper, mend the shame he carried? How could ink erase the memories of betrayal? Yet as he stared at the blank page, he realized that this gift was not about erasing the past, it was about acknowledging it, confronting it, and shaping the man he wanted to become. That night, by the light of a small fire, Jonah began to write. His hand shook as he formed each word, at first awkwardly, almost painfully. He wrote of fear, of mistakes, of guilt, of nights spent haunted by memories of friends he had abandoned. He wrote of the emptiness that had gnawed at him while fleeing through the wilderness, of the relief and awe he had felt upon meeting Dakota, and of the cautious hope that had begun to flicker within him. The words came haltingly at first, but with each line he felt a subtle shift. His burdens did not vanish, but they felt lighter, parceled out into letters and sentences that no longer belonged solely to his mind. Dakota watched silently from a short distance, never intruding, yet present in a way that made Jonah feel supported rather than judged. In the days that followed, writing became a ritual. Jonah chronicled small victories, failures, observations of village life, and reflections on courage and honor. Each day he poured a little more of himself onto the pages, allowing thoughts and emotions he had buried deep to surface. The pen Dakota had given him became a tool not only for communication but for transformation. Through writing, Jonah began to see a path forward. He recognized patterns in his thoughts, identified the choices that had led him astray, and slowly he discovered ways to make amends, not by undoing the past, but by shaping his present and future with integrity. The pen offered him clarity, a mirror for his soul and a bridge toward redemption. It was a quiet revolution, internal but profound, turning a man who had once sold out for safety into someone capable of courage in a different, deeper form. One evening, as the fire crackled and the village settled into a serene hush, Jonah set the pen down and looked at Dakota. "Thank you," he said simply, though words felt inadequate. Dakota nodded, his expression calm but knowing, as if he understood that this moment marked the beginning of something far larger than survival. It was the beginning of transformation, of a man learning to reconcile fear, guilt, and hope into a life worth living. For Jonah, the pen was more than a tool. It was a lifeline. It offered a chance to confront the past, embrace the present, and write a future where he could be more than the coward he had once believed himself to be. And in the quiet strength of the Apache warrior who had given it, Jonah understood that true guidance often comes not in force or judgment, but in the gentle offering of a means to heal. The morning sun spilled over the hills, casting long golden shafts of light across the village. Jonah stepped outside the small dwelling Dakota had prepared for him, a modest structure of wood and clay with a roof woven from reeds. It was simple, unadorned, yet radiated a quiet warmth he had never known in all his years of wandering or fleeing. This was not merely a shelter from the elements, it was a sanctuary, a place where he could begin to piece together the fragments of the man he had lost to fear and betrayal. Dakota watched from a distance, his tall figure outlined against the rising sun. Without a word, he gestured toward the home, then to the small garden nearby and the flowing river. The message was clear. This place was Jonah's to claim, to inhabit, and to make a space for himself within the rhythm of the village. Jonah approached the dwelling cautiously, running his hands over the rough-hewn walls, the edges of the doorway, the floorboards he had cleaned and swept himself. The act of shaping and tending to his new home felt foreign yet comforting. For the first time in months, he experienced a sense of permanence, a feeling he had once feared more than danger itself. Over the following days, Jonah began to personalize his space. He arranged his meager belongings with care, set the few tools and writings he had accumulated in order, and added small touches inspired by the natural surroundings. A bundle of dried flowers, a carved wooden figurine he had made during moments of idle reflection. Each action, though small, reinforced a growing sense of agency and stability. For a man whose life had been defined by flight and fear, the act of creating a home was transformative. The villagers took notice of Jonah's efforts. They offered subtle guidance: how to repair a section of wall, the proper placement of a hearth for warmth, how to cultivate the garden to yield vegetables and herbs. Their assistance was never intrusive. It was gentle, a steady encouragement that spoke more of trust than command. Jonah learned to appreciate this subtle form of teaching, realizing that he was not being coddled, but invited to participate fully in a community that valued collaboration and care. Dakota, in particular, remained a constant presence. He did not dictate Jonah's every move but observed patiently, offering a quiet nod of approval when Jonah made progress and a gentle correction when he faltered. On some days, they would sit together outside the dwelling, watching the river flow and listening to the rustle of leaves. Dakota never forced conversation, yet the silence between them was instructive. Jonah came to understand that a home was more than walls and shelter. It was a space where one's spirit could grow, where one could confront fears, and where one could begin to reconcile with the past. It was during these quiet moments that Jonah began to feel the first glimmers of belonging. The home, though modest, became a canvas for his thoughts and actions. He wrote at a small table by the window, chronicling not only the events of the day but his reflections on courage, trust, and redemption. He tended the garden, learning patience and consistency. He repaired small structures around the dwelling, each nail hammered and reed woven, strengthening his confidence. Slowly, the sense of being adrift faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of living intentionally, of contributing to something larger than himself. One evening, as Jonah sat on the doorstep watching the sunset bleed across the horizon, he felt a sense of peace he had thought impossible. The home was his anchor, the first place in years where fear did not dictate every decision, where he could rest without guilt pressing on his chest. It was a symbol of the trust Dakota and the village had placed in him, a tangible reminder that even a man who had once sold out for safety could be given a second chance. In this home, Jonah realized, he could begin the slow process of rebuilding, not just a shelter but a life. He understood that the walls, the hearth, and the garden were only the beginning. The true foundation was his own willingness to change, to embrace responsibility, and to live with integrity. The home was a gift, but it was also a challenge to fill it not just with objects, but with courage, honesty, and purpose. And as the first stars began to prick the night sky, Jonah knew deep in his chest that this place would be the heart of his redemption. Within its walls, with the guidance of Dakota and the quiet strength of the village, he would learn not only to survive but to truly live. Jonah's home had become more than shelter. It had become a sanctuary, a place where the quiet rhythms of the village and the steady guidance of Dakota allowed him to reflect in ways he never had before. Yet even amidst the comfort and routine, the shadow of his past lingered. He could not erase the memory of betrayal, nor the guilt that had driven him into the wilderness. But now, with the pen Dakota had given him, Jonah discovered a means to confront it, a way to wrestle with his fear, shame, and regret through the written word. Each morning, before the village stirred fully, Jonah would sit at the small wooden table by the window, the rising sun spilling light across his paper. He wrote in bursts, sometimes pouring out memories that made his hands tremble, other times pausing to consider the lessons he had learned from the villagers. He wrote of courage in small moments, the patience required to weave reeds, the quiet endurance needed to settle disputes, the humility in listening before acting. He wrote of guilt, of the ache in his chest that never fully left him, and of the longing to make amends in ways he did not yet understand. Through writing, Jonah began to see himself with a clarity he had never possessed. Each sentence, each carefully chosen word, forced him to confront truths he had hidden from himself. He admitted to cowardice, to fear-driven choices, and to the pain he had caused others, but he also began to recognize moments of strength, no longer measured by survival alone but by integrity, reflection, and perseverance. The act of writing transformed guilt into awareness, fear into insight, and shame into responsibility. The villagers watched Jonah's quiet transformation with curiosity and patience. Dakota remained a steady presence, offering guidance without intrusion. He encouraged Jonah not to write merely for himself, but to consider the stories of others, the bravery, wisdom, and resilience of the Apache people he now called his neighbors. Jonah began recording not just his own journey, but the lives around him, the careful hands of the elders weaving baskets, the laughter of children learning from mistakes, the patient guidance offered to those younger or weaker. In this act, he realized that redemption was not only personal, it was relational. His words could honor the lives of those around him and help preserve their wisdom and courage. As days turned to weeks, Jonah's writing took on a rhythm, a sacred cadence that mirrored the flow of the river near his home. He chronicled the natural world with care, the shifting seasons, the migration of birds, the quiet growth of the garden he tended. He documented the lessons Dakota imparted through silence and observation. He even began crafting letters in imagination, addressed to the friends he had betrayed, attempting to articulate remorse, regret, and hope for reconciliation. Though he had no plans to send them, the act of writing them allowed Jonah to face his past without being consumed by it. One evening, after a long day of work in the village, Jonah sat by the fire with Dakota. He handed the warrior a page he had written that recounted his flight through the wilderness, his fear, and the moment he had first met him. Dakota read silently, then looked up with eyes that reflected neither judgment nor pity but understanding. "The heart speaks best when it is not afraid," he said simply. Jonah realized in that moment that words had become more than a record. They were a bridge between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. By the time the first frost of the season touched the edges of the village, Jonah's home was filled with stacks of pages, chronicles of fear and courage, failure and redemption. The act of writing had begun to heal him. His guilt remained, yes, but it no longer ruled him. It had been transformed into awareness, guiding him to act with thoughtfulness, empathy, and integrity. Through words, Jonah had begun to reclaim himself. He was no longer merely a man who had sold out for safety. He was a man striving to live with honor, honesty, and purpose. The pen, once foreign and awkward in his hands, had become a tool of liberation. Each stroke of ink allowed Jonah to face his past, understand his present, and imagine a future where courage took many forms, not just in acts of survival, but in reflection, accountability, and the quiet strength of honest expression. Word traveled faster than Jonah expected. The wilderness held whispers, and the settlers he had betrayed, Thomas, Mary, and the others, had learned of his survival and newfound life among the Apache. Jonah first heard the rumors from children playing near the river, their innocent chatter carrying news he had thought long buried. His chest tightened, a familiar weight settling over him, fear, shame, anticipation. He had fled once, yes, but now he would have to face the consequences of his choices. When the first group of settlers arrived, Jonah felt a mixture of dread and resolve. They stood at the edge of the village, eyes narrowed, hands gripping weapons with uncertainty. Jonah recognized their faces instantly. Thomas, tall and weathered, stared at him with disbelief and anger. Mary's copper hair shone in the sunlight, but her eyes held suspicion and hurt that Jonah could not meet without flinching. He had expected anger, perhaps even violence, and the weight of it made his knees tremble. Yet for the first time he did not run. Dakota appeared silently at Jonah's side, a calm presence, a steady anchor against the storm of emotion. He did not speak for Jonah, but his gaze conveyed trust and patience. Jonah realized then that he would confront the past not with fear, but with honesty and courage, the tools he had honed through weeks of living, learning and writing. He stepped forward, hands visible, voice steady despite the quiver in his chest. "I know you have every right to hate me," he said, his tone raw but sincere. "I betrayed you. I ran for my own safety. I thought it would keep me alive, but all it did was leave me haunted. I am sorry. I cannot undo the past, but I am here and I will take responsibility for what I've done." Silence followed. Jonah felt every heartbeat, the tension thick and oppressive. Thomas's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning Jonah as if measuring the truth in his words. Mary's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands clasped in quiet control. Then slowly Thomas lowered his weapon, though his glare remained. "You left us," he said finally, voice heavy with accusation. "Some of us didn't make it because of you." "I know," Jonah admitted, the words like coals in his mouth. "And I will carry that with me for the rest of my life. I can't undo it, but I can try to live differently, to do better, to honor what we lost by not losing myself entirely." He gestured toward the village, toward Dakota and the people who had taken him in. "I have learned what courage truly is. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it even when it is easier to run." Mary's gaze softened slightly, though her suspicion lingered. She stepped forward, eyes searching Jonah's face. "How do we know you've changed?" she asked. Jonah swallowed and held up one of his journals. "Because I've spent every day trying to understand myself and the choices I made. I've written it all down, not to excuse myself, but to prove that I'm trying to be accountable, to grow. My actions here will speak louder than words ever could." Dakota remained nearby, silent, but his presence bolstered Jonah. The settlers looked around the village, the thriving homes, the gardens, the way Jonah worked alongside the Apache without pretense or complaint. Slowly Thomas nodded, a reluctant acknowledgement of the man Jonah had become. Mary studied him a long moment, then with a careful exhale lowered her guard slightly. The tension did not vanish entirely, but a fragile understanding began to take root. The confrontation was not a full absolution. It was not a moment of triumph. But it was a beginning. Jonah realized that facing the past did not mean erasing it. It meant standing in the light of one's mistakes and choosing every day to act differently. And as the settlers lingered at the edge of the village, watching Jonah's life unfold, he felt a weight lift, not entirely gone, but lightened by courage, honesty, and the lessons he had learned in the wilderness and the village. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, Jonah stood at the river, looking at the reflection of his own face. The man staring back was no longer solely defined by fear and betrayal. He had survived, yes, but more importantly, he had begun to live with integrity, compassion, and a willingness to face the consequences of his actions. The past remained, but it no longer ruled him. He had confronted it, and in doing so had begun the final steps toward true redemption. Years passed in the quiet rhythm of the village, and Jonah's life became woven into its very fabric. The man who had once fled in fear, who had betrayed friends in pursuit of safety, had transformed into someone the village, and even the settlers he had once wronged, could trust and respect. His days were filled with work and reflection, teaching the younger generation the lessons he had learned, both practical and moral. Each action, each choice, reflected the man he had become, a stark contrast to the one who had run through the wilderness haunted by guilt. Jonah had made a habit of writing every day. His journals, once filled with remorse and self-recrimination, now held stories of resilience, observations of nature, the wisdom of the elders, and the quiet courage of the villagers. He wrote not for fame or recognition, but to preserve knowledge, to honor the lives and traditions that had guided him toward redemption. Dakota often read the pages with him, offering insight or a subtle correction, and together they refined the lessons into narratives that could endure beyond any single lifetime. Jonah's writing became a bridge between worlds, the settlers, the Apache people, and the universal truths of human struggle and growth. The home Dakota had given him remained the center of his existence. He had expanded it slightly, not to seek comfort or luxury, but to create a space for community. Children would gather there in the evenings, listening to Jonah read aloud, or practicing the skills he had mastered under Dakota's guidance. Elders shared stories by the fire, and Jonah's pen recorded every detail, every subtle lesson, as if capturing the essence of a life rebuilt from fear, guilt, and survival. The walls of the home, once a symbol of refuge, had become a symbol of hope and continuity, a testament to the transformative power of trust and guidance. Jonah also found a place for reconciliation beyond the village. Settlers who had initially regarded him with suspicion now came to see him not as a coward, but as a man who had faced his past and chosen to grow from it. Thomas and Mary, once distant and hurt, became companions in small projects and daily routines. Their interactions were careful at first, but over time, trust deepened, proving that redemption could extend outward, touching not only one's own soul, but the lives of those previously harmed. Jonah had learned that courage was not only about confronting danger, but also about confronting the consequences of one's choices and embracing responsibility, even when it was uncomfortable. Dakota remained the guiding presence in Jonah's life, a silent reminder that transformation required both patience and perspective. Under the warrior's mentorship, Jonah understood that legacy was not defined by survival alone, but by the values one embodied, the knowledge one shared, and the courage to live honestly. The pen had become more than a tool. It had become an instrument of continuity, a way to pass on wisdom and courage to generations who would never know the wilderness he had fled, yet could learn from the journey he had endured. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Jonah stood at the riverbank near his home. Children played in the shallow water, elders tended the garden, and the villagers moved in quiet harmony. He looked at the reflection of his own face in the river, a man marked by scars of guilt and survival, yet softened and strengthened by love, patience, and integrity. The past was still part of him, but it no longer defined him. Every decision, every written word, every act of guidance or compassion reinforced the truth he had discovered years ago. Courage, redemption, and legacy were earned through perseverance, honesty, and the willingness to grow. Jonah had been given a second chance, and he had turned it into more than survival. He had created a life where mistakes could be acknowledged without consuming the present, where lessons were shared generously, and where the man he had become could leave an enduring impact. His home, his writings, and his life among the Apache became a testament to what was possible when fear was faced. Guilt was transformed and trust was embraced. As the stars appeared in the night sky, Jonah felt a profound peace. He had fled once for safety, but through courage, guidance, and reflection, he had built something far greater, a life of purpose, a home of belonging, and a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. In the quiet of the village, with the river murmuring and the firelight flickering, Jonah understood fully that he was no longer a man running from fear. He was a man who had finally learned to live.